Hello everyone, welcome to Bravely Better, a series dedicated to teen mental health education and awareness. Joining me on my first episode, It's Okay to Not Be Okay, is Dr. McTighe. Dr. McTighe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Arthur. It's great to be here.
Dr. McTighe, I know you have a long career with mental health, and I want you all to tell my audience what you have done and why you chose this as your field of profession.
Yeah, it's something that I have been very passionate about for a long time. I've been very fortunate to study psychology and business as a connected field. I've been a licensed psychologist now in the mental health field for almost 20 years, working in a variety of settings. Currently, I am working in corporate insurance, switching back to forensics as a state director in the next month or so. And in addition to that, running a private practice and seeing patients, which includes adults, children, and families.
Interesting. Forensic psychology. What is it? I don't know about it, and I'm pretty sure my audience would be interested in knowing about it.
Yeah, it's the connection, intersection of psychology, psychiatry, medicine, and law. Our job is to kind of look at someone who's been accused of doing something they shouldn't have and kind of see what kind of needs they might have, or if it's something that's more behaviorally or criminally based, and kind of set them aside for treatment or custody.
How is it different from psycho-legal?
Yeah, so that's just a different word that sort of connects all of those different factors.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm curious to know, when I asked you, you immediately said, okay, to be on my show. Why?
I did. It was exciting to have an opportunity to talk, informally about mental health and the connection to teens and children, which is a passion of mine and has been for a very long time. Something that I've been fortunate enough, again, to study, practice, learn, and train. And now being a father, just seeing it from all different aspects and having an opportunity to come here and talk with you about it, I think was really exciting. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the mental health crisis that is growing among our young children and teens today.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is driving that?
I think it's a combination of factors. In general, you look at the environment with the stress that everyone is going through on the heels of COVID and the pandemic, which is something that we haven't gone through as a society in about 100 years or so. So when you throw that in with the technology and the interfaces and the unknowns and the fears and just the confusion, all of those things come together with the perfect storm, if you will. And then social media taking another factor to kind of present this curated life that people present in such a way that's very difficult for people, especially teens, to kind of understand that that's not really sort of how things are behind the veil, if you will, because people can present and act in a certain way on camera, but when they're out there in the world, it's very different. I often say in my practice, there's a very big difference between theory and practice. We can do the best we can in research in the books, but when we get out there to do certain things, they don't always line up. And so when you talk about social media and managing stressors, it can be very, very difficult to figure out sort of right from wrong, what's real, what's not, and how we manage it. And so the processing of that can become a crisis because how people feel what they do doesn't line with the insides or their group or their family, their environment, their culture.
Absolutely. And lately I've been hearing about social media. Did this social media, did that social media, contributed this. But do you think that social media is the only reason why we have mental health issue among adolescents today?
No, I think that's an accelerant. But we have biological predispositions. We've got family stressors, family dynamics. We have just the general stress, as I mentioned, or the pressures of kids today with academics, trying to fit in socially, trying to find their groove in a community, trying to skill that they can build. And, among other things, just getting decent advice that's level and grounded versus following the new trends or fads that really don't have any safety or evidence base behind them. Some of them, quite frankly, are dangerous, and yet they do them, which I think just drives that mental health crisis even further.
Is there any way you think we can prevent mental health illness?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think understanding where somebody is at and meeting them in a level, grounded way, whether it's your parent, adult, even a friend group could be possible to do that. But to provide access if needed. But I think it's important to understand that just because somebody has a problem doesn't necessarily mean it's pathological. So not everything needs a certain level of intervention. However, being able to have an open environment just to kind of talk about certain things is really important to demystify the stigma behind mental health needs or stress or how somebody copes with certain things.
Very true. And for us to talk about it, mental health illness was so much of an adult thing. Now it is growing. It's almost an epidemic which is spreading across our young children. So, why do you think our young children have become victims of this?
Great question. I think if you look at the numbers, the last I checked, depression was 1 out of 5 disabilities and the leading disability in the country
Wow.
right now. And just from the research, if you have a parent that's struggling with depression or substance abuse, anxiety, or just paying their bills, quite frankly, that's going to trickle down to the children in addition to the other factors, modeling and how parents deal with stress to show that it can be okay or quite frankly very difficult, I think is what we're talking about, just to understand how you feel. And the real crisis in what we're talking about, and what you're questioning is, I think in my opinion, is that people, children especially, or teenagers, often underestimate their abilities to handle stress. And they overestimate the stressors or the seriousness or the longevity of what they're actually facing, and so it can make teens act impulsively without really thinking and using their executive functioning to make these decisions or find grounding within their community or their friend group to see if what they're feeling is normal. A lot of times it is, but sometimes it's not, and that's okay. I mean, that's the whole point. It's okay not to feel okay.
So, mental health illness is one segment.
Yeah.
It's grown and diversified into self-harm. Children who are burning themselves, cutting themselves, hitting, bruising. What do you think is driving them to do that?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the overarching themes here is exposure. Seeing things and finding ways to alleviate your pain. At the basis of self-harm, I think, is that it's a way to find expression through control. When people, children, teens, even adults, feel that they're overwhelmed and they can't manage something, so they take it within their own hands, quite literally, to find ways to recenter or repurpose their pain so that they feel in control and grounded in a way. So, it might sound contradictory, but it's a way to find healing in the beginning parts. I think it becomes reinforced in a difficult way. Sometimes it's difficult to stop or change. And just like anything else, the more you do something, the more you need of it. Which is where you start to get into really concerning behaviors that become a little bit more lethal or impulsive, and it's just difficult to curtail because those signs are often difficult to see. I think going back to one of your questions was looking for changes in behaviors, changes in mood, even maybe the things that might be a little more obvious, cuts, scars, or bruises, but some of those things aren't straightforward, even to the trained eye. So being able to ask questions about that, I think is really, really important.
It's a great point that you mentioned that they want to conceal pain.
Yeah.
So, do you think that a cut is equivalent to being suicidal?
Great question. There's a term, non-suicidal self-injury, as NSSI. In mental health, we call it alphabet soup, right? Everything has letters and acronyms and things like that, and so we don't want to get lost in that. But just because somebody cuts doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to kill themselves. And it doesn't always mean they're looking for a cry for help. Now, sometimes it does, but it's important to ask those questions, but in a non-judgmental, non-threatening type of way. Because I think, for teens especially who are trying to figure themselves out by whatever means and ways possible, those questions can be difficult to interpret, and then they can often feel lost with it, and it might put them back in that mental state where they feel there's nothing else to do. So all of that pain or emotion or confusion comes out in a very difficult kind of way. So, I think something else that's important to recognize is just because somebody's suicidal or they're cutting themselves, it doesn't mean that they have a serious pathology behind it. It doesn't mean that they need to go to a hospital or take medication right away. I think that's a really big part of demystifying what it is to be not okay and just to deal with stress, quite frankly. I don't know it's ever been quite as difficult as it is outside in our generation right now.
Absolutely, and I think the stress that our children carrying is much more than what we had growing up. Back in the day when growing up, think about it, we did not have anything called as mental health issue among young children, but it has become over the last 10 years, it has become a growing issue, and statistics are horrifying. 1 in 10 children have some way or the other between the age of 10 to 18 have engaged themselves in some kind of self-harm.
Yeah.
So is that concerning to you?
I think so. I think, as we see our generation kind of move from this collective social group where we're seeing people doing things experientially, running around in the mud and the dirt, as you say, or, walking both ways to school in the snow, right?
Yeah.
Everybody has life connected at their fingertips now, but as a result of that, we've almost become more distant socially. So we don't get to have that interplay that we used to, or have those bumps and bruises and develop, the resilience in the way that you might, and then gain support through a collective group. I think at the end of the day, it's great to have a phone and have everything at your fingertips, but you lose out on that personal touch that people have just to feel and have someone put their arm around you, give you a hug, or even knock you on the shoulder, if you will, right? I think there's a lot of times where people talk about, attention deficit, right? Back in the day, we just get it, whatever it might be, get you going, get your mind right, stay focused. It is what it is, right? Things have just changed a lot, and we've come to learn that certain things in the past aren't okay. Hitting without explanation or understanding the things that would, require punishment. We've come a long way with that, but now everything seems to have a label. And, for better or worse, there's a lot of things out there that people think that can be solved or resolved by a pill, and it's not always the case. The symptoms can improve, but it really doesn't get to what's going on underneath the veil, so to speak.
Very true. So you'd say that society also plays a big role for us. Specifically, it's been stigmatized as a taboo.
Yeah.
So being labeled, is that a fear that every parent have even today?
I think so. I think, in general, but you might find a pocket of parents and people that sort of take some pride in ownership of having a label or diagnosis. Doing forensics in the juvenile system, it happened often where I would meet someone for the first time and go through and they say, I'm bipolar. That's what it is. I said, okay. Well, how do you feel when someone says no to you? I'll lose it. Okay, that's not really bipolar. You're just dealing with consequences. You're not learning from things because maybe someone hasn't had the time or resources. So we don't want to be judgmental because everybody will solve their problems in a different way. However, it doesn't rise to the level of these serious labels or pathological definitions of what would require more intensive treatment. And I think, it's important to kind of parse that out, which is why, again, to demystify mental health through the eyes and the lens of an educated and licensed professional that's non-judgmental, that can really help answer some questions if need be.
Many times when someone gets to know that someone's child is seeing a therapist or a psychiatrist, there is a label that's put on that child and they're seen with that lens only. So tell me, doctor, is that a taboo?
Yeah, taboo is difficult, but it's, it really tries to pull in the values of individuals or culture specifically, because not all cultures and families are going to see things and really want to be open to other professionals or outsiders, and rightfully so. That's okay. That gets back to my point before we're talking that not everything is pathological. I think that's probably the biggest thing, because you see these influencers out there that talk about certain diagnosis and this is what we do, and I think if that gets taken out of context, it can also kind of really cut against the culture and the family values, and really make it difficult for the parents and the children and the groups to kind of connect and just talk through what would be normal developmental stressors.
Interesting. So what is it that as parents we have to watch out as warning signs? Are there anything in specific that we have to look out?
It's a great question. So one of the stories or analogies I like to use is, if we think about parents and guardians as a safe harbor next to the ocean, life and development, the goal is to get everybody having their resources together and then send them out in the ocean so that they can go on their journey, right? And while they're out there, parents, guardians, adults, families, brothers, whatever it might be, can provide them a haven in the middle of the ocean, if you will, so that when the seas get rocky, they have a place to go, rest, repair, whatever that might be, and then send them back out. So for parents, it's important to look at the environmental factors, in terms of friend groups, their grades, their eating, their sleeping habits, are they exercising, are they taking care of their body? You know, a lot of this really is important for kids and teenagers to do on their own, to figure out their own independence, but they need to come back and doc, as I was saying, to kind of get those repairs and checkups to make sure things are okay, so that when they can go back out, keep exploring, each time they go a little farther. Because as parents, we want to set them up to buoy them so they can go explore the world and go farther than we did, right? And so we want to give them the resources to do that.
Right, you rightly said that, but how do we draw that fine line where you are not being pushy, but at the same time you are setting your child up for success and taking this thought of self-harm out of their mind?
That's a great point. So I think we're talking about, how do you handle things that come at you that you don't understand? And when is it okay to ask a little bit more directive questions and apply a little bit more rules, guidelines, regulations, if you will? You know, I think this comes into the culture family piece, where every family is going to have a little bit of a different hard line. But in general, you know, you want to watch their screen time, you want to watch their basic self-care. And quite frankly, if you think that you're seeing behaviors, so again, changes in weight, changes in attitude, maybe sometimes children are wearing heavy clothes that don't fit the weather, or light, or they're giving away their prized possessions. That's when you want to have a little bit more of an intervention step, and maybe have an alliance with a professional. Maybe it's their pediatrician, maybe it's their teacher, whatever that might be, to have different eyes outside of the home so you can line up your stories and not make an impulsive jump, but honestly check in on them if you see any of these sort of risk factors playing out.
Absolutely, great point that you said. So, do you think educating our teens about mental health issue is necessary? Should we be talking to them, or do you think they are too fragile for us to have that discussion?
That's a great question. You know, I think the answer to that might be different 10, 20 years ago, but you know, to our point here today, the exposure that these children, adults, and teens have at their fingertips is unprecedented. So I think it's okay to sit down and have these conversations, maybe at developmental arcs, but you can sort of gauge what they're looking at. And I think for parents to monitor their screen time and their social media apps, you know, again, to each family's discernment, but you know, everything's at their fingertips. So I think it's important to educate them ahead of time so that when they have questions, they feel comfortable to come to you. And as a parent, it's not always the easiest thing to do, but not to be punitive, to think that I'm going to take that away from you, because, you know, what do? We always chase things that we can't have, or that we're told not to, and it makes people want to sort of run after that forbidden fruit, if you will, which is what we don't necessarily want to do. But as a parent, it's important for them to experience these things. So, you know, the non-suicidal self-injury might be something that happens in more frequency, and we might not necessarily realize that, and it might not escalate to the point that the parents even really have to address it in a serious way, but to give the children understanding that if they do, we're here for you, you know. And I think regular check-ins are great, family dinners, maybe walking the dog, going for a hike on a Friday morning, something like that is really important to kind of build into the routine of the family unit.
Do you think acceptance among other children, the transition from elementary to middle to high, does that cause any kind of stress that leads our children to lose control, not think straight, and engage in activities which is not gonna do them a long-term good?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the frontal lobe, the part that's responsible for executive functioning, all the adult things that we deal with as adults, right? Paying bills, making decisions, putting something down, we want to keep going. For boys, it doesn't really fully develop until 25, 27. Whereas women are a little bit younger, you know, because women are a little more advanced, and that's good, okay? But so when we start talking about elementary students, teenage students, high school students, even college kids, you know, to be able to have that formal executive thought, to really caution and use full judgment, is important to realize it's not always there. And to this point, that's okay, right? But I think what you're getting to here is that it's happening earlier and earlier, that these children are being exposed. So what we might have seen in high school might be playing out in middle school now.
Yeah.
And what we might have seen in middle school is happening in high school or elementary school. You know, there could be a lot of reasons for that, which we've been talking about, but you know, we can't stop technology or the science or the groups and the things like that, but we can certainly try our best to monitor it and step in as parents, because that's what we need to do, or adults or community members.
So encouraging our children to speak up, Is that important message that we have to convey to them?
Yes, I think so. I mean, this is what it is, just to kind of get it out there. If you see something, say something. It's okay to ask questions. You know, not everything has a social acceptance or an understanding. Something I was just talking about the other day was, you know, and this is a difficult thing to say, but what do we teach our young girls if someone's doing something to them or that's violating the boundaries? We tell them to scream fire, not rape or assault or anything. You know, and why is that? Because who's more willing to run into a fire or than to intervene? It doesn't make sense when you're talking about in isolation, but when we're talking about somebody really in need, you know, we have to say these things to get attention from others, because that's what we need. We need help. And, you know, however we get it, that's okay. But by talking about it, hopefully we can get to a place where it becomes a little bit more open and free, that it's accepting, and that people don't feel contained or judged. Because I think that goes back to that need where you have all this emotion and confusion and you don't know what to do with it. And so you go and you take it out on yourself because you're the safest thing to do that to.
Absolutely, absolutely. When do you think parents have to seek medical help for their children? I mean, as a parent, the first thing that comes to my mind is the parent playing therapist first. We all think we have a license, we are professionals, we know our children better, and we play therapist, and well, it does not go well. So when do you say, don't play the therapist, go ask for professional help?
Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, I think anybody who is a professional in this field would probably laugh at this question too, because children don't always listen to their parents regardless. But the big thing here, I think it's important that parents are the experts. You know, like that's what we do to help facilitate the children their own resilience, to let them know you're the expert in you. But when you need a little bit of outside intervention, you want to look at different environmental functioning, right? So we have home, school, community, or sports, or whatever you might have. So if 2 out of the 4 or 3 out of the 4 aren't going well, you certainly want to think about what can we do to take this up to the next level. And again, not all problems are pathological, so you don't want to just jump into medication. So I'd be cautious about any doctors, no offense out there, that would just jump into the first line of, well, we need Lexapro, it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Zoloft's great for 6-year-olds. It's happened, sure, but you want to look at more deeper issues, like, you know, if there's trauma and things that are really difficult to talk about, then you might want to bring that into the intervention stage. But to get them out to talk to somebody, it's not going to be easy, you know, but ideally if you can find someone they can relate to and have some fun with it. So if you want to have an option, look up resources. I like psychologytoday.com, a little biased, but you know, to have them search for providers and say, hey, you know, of these 3 that we looked at, which one seems kind of interesting to you? Someone that they can relate to, maybe they identify with. Hey, I'll go talk to them. Cool. Let's make it 3 times. Can you do 3 times? Great. And so you give them a little bit of leeway in there. So it's not a one and done type of thing, or you don't force them to do certain things, because you want them to try and have some exposure to something else.
So where do they start? Do they start seeing a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist? Where do we start?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, anybody that is licensed, has training, has the proper supervision, is equipped to at least triage if needed to provide a little bit more depth to your question. You know, certainly if it doesn't seem like there's maladaptive functioning across all environments, you know, they're not failing school, they're not getting into fights all the time, they're somewhat okay at school. You know, counselor, psychologist is okay. You know, the way that the medical and insurance field is these days, most psychiatrists don't do a lot of talk therapy, you know, and some psychologists will do it, but not all of them are on insurance panels. So that becomes another barrier of you know, what insurance do we have? And the first questions are always, are you a network?
Yeah.
You know, do you have a deductible, right? You know, January is always a different time of month because everything resets.
Yeah.
And the frustrating thing I'll say is not all health plans waive their deductible for mental health. So sometimes someone comes in, great intentions, but they have a $2,000 or $3,000 deductible. And in January, they just don't have the time, space, or budget for that. And so they'll put it off until maybe March, June. Things change by that point, right? And then everything kind of heats up again in September, October, at the end of the year. So everything kind of goes in cycles. So I think it's important, you know, find someone that you can relate to, that you can fit in. And most of these professionals, I should say all of them, should be upfront and transparent, because actually they just passed a law recently that was no surprise billing. So patients can't get hit with these bills.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at the end of a visit, end of the month, it's all of a sudden 10 times, 4 times what you expected.
Right.
And then they won't see you again if you don't pay it, which is a disservice to the patients and the community at large.
That is one of the fear for, I think, many of the parents, that you go see a psychiatrist, psychologist, and then bam comes a $10,000 bill because they were out of network, or they were not, they didn't cover the deductible or whatnot. So that fear, do you think, can our insurance system change things?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. You know, it's interesting that there was a paper, a seminal paper, I think the mid to late 1800s, a long time ago, that wrote about the connection and the parity between mental health and physical health.
Mm-hmm.
You know, saying that if your physical health is great, but your mental health isn't, you're not healthy, so to speak, and vice versa. It wasn't until about 2008 that there was a law that formally mandated mental health parity.
Oh, right. Okay.
Meaning that, like, if your physical and mental health should be covered with the same general coverage. And of course the laws and things change as a moving target. So, you know, I'm hopeful that at some point they line these things up and they fully recognize that. But the challenges again come back to, how big is the agency? Can you meet with the same provider? Are they going to be there? Because a lot of times for professionals in mental health, the turnover is kind of often, because it's a stressful field inherently, right? So we're talking about adults, kids that are having a hard time managing their stress. And so for the providers, trying to hold all this in can be quite difficult too. So across the board, self-care is really, really paramount.
True. So do you see more and more students graduating from psychology as major?
I do. You know, I was at Georgia State for a while when I moved here from California, and I think their psych department had, I want to say like 2,000 undergrads, something like that. It was a lot. And so, and now I'm hearing, you know, they're teaching psychology in high school, which is great. So giving this exposure to students earlier, more often, really giving them the opportunity to see what's out there professionally. But, you know, it's funny and interesting to think that not everything you study is going to lead to what you do. So for me, even in grads, I never took a psychology class in high school. I never took a forensic class in college. And now I'm a state and federally recognized forensic psychologist without the formal education, but the training, the supervision, all of those things make up for the formal education. So just because you don't see it in the class doesn't mean you can't get to it by way of training, education, and work. But you just have to look for it and sort of like reach out and develop your network, which really gets back to our main point in the beginning with middle school kids, teenagers, to develop those soft skills and interpersonal skills in elementary, middle school, and high school, so that by the time they're, you know, young college students and that brain of theirs is fully developing, they feel confident, they can make good decisions, they can present themselves in a way that would say, hey, I want to call this guy back and this young girl back, and give them an opportunity.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, coming to the last section of our show, what is the coping mechanisms that you can recommend to our parents and children to start using when they feel anxious, when they feel stressed? What can they do at home?
Yeah, great point. So for another analogy, right, coping tools are like the Swiss Army knife, right? There's different tools for different needs. We can use a tool, but it's not purpose for the right thing. So the more you use it, the less effective it's going to be. So you want to keep in mind that you're always kind of keeping your toolbox sharp, so to speak. So in lieu of professional help, the general approach I like to take philosophically is that everybody needs 3 things. We need something to keep our brain sharp, stimulate us. We need something to do to relax, and we need to do something to do for fun. You know, and if we can develop our priorities through boundaries of these 3 separate things, generally speaking, we should have a good balance mentally and physically. But you really want to emphasize eating, sleeping, diet, exercise, and socializing. You know, the basic things that we learn in elementary school, like they're there for a reason, as fundamental building blocks. A little more clinically oriented, I'm a big fan of journaling. I think it's a really positive and strong way to help us all, really, but teenagers especially, connect their internal thoughts to their external world. So if you're sitting and writing, you're making your mind create these things that you're thinking and seeing it play out. Now, nobody should ever read this. Unfiltered writing is the best kind of writing. So as parents, don't look in there, it's okay. Sometimes you don't want to see what's in there, right? And you know, you don't want to come back and look at it, that's okay, right? But you want to give them the opportunity, encouragement to do that.
Right. So when you see your child journaling, obviously
Yeah.
parents' curiosity triggers, so you want to take a peek at the journal. What is the secret? How do we do it without them knowing it?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. We don't know everything. We can't answer all the right questions. I think as parents, sometimes we're going to have some natural curiosity.
Mhm.
And this gets back to your point, though, about some of the behaviors that you'd be looking for. If you're seeing things that are changing, that are different from what you're used to, you might want to have more of an inclination and justify it to go take a look. Hopefully you're going to ask these questions before, because consent's important, right? Your children don't want to see you walking in and looking through their journal, because at that point they might not open up to you for a little bit. You don't want to do that. But if you explain your concerns, I think it has a better chance to find some grounding and work on the communication that we've been talking about right now.
Very interesting point. Get their consent. Don't take a sneak peek.
Yes.
And don't get caught when you're taking a sneak peek. But seriously, doctor, what would you tell parents who are dealing with issues with their children today, who have mental health issues and who are stigmatized?
Yeah, I think, to tell them it's okay to not feel okay, right? And if we're looking at just poor functioning, different functioning across the environments that we're talking about, work, school, home, social, to really take that next step and be a little bit more assertive. There's a big difference between being aggressive and being assertive, but explaining yourself in a way that's supportive and constructive, because without that support and giving them options moving forward, it doesn't necessarily feel helpful. It just feels critical.
Right.
And so you really want to have that empathic, warm sort of approach to help them, but be sort of assertive with it. That's okay. You're the parents. You should know more than they do. But when you don't, it's okay to have some humbleness and humility, right? Like, I'm figuring this out just as you're figuring this out. I think a lot of times parents don't fully acknowledge that, because it might make them feel like they're weak, or their kids won't look at them the same way. So if you can deliver that message in a really sort of unconditional way, I think it's really important.
Parents, kids, it's okay to not be okay. Thank you so much, doctor, for joining me on this show, and I really appreciate all the insightful thoughts. I'm sure my audience have understood that mental health illness is not a taboo. They can talk about it, and they can together be bravely better. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.